Hi, let's get this started for this week and figure out how well you did and what we can do for this week. I read the relative clauses that were in the Dropbox where you combine them again like you had on the discussion board. And about half of you understand what a relative clause is. I'd say about a quarter of you sort of know, and there's a quarter of you that really don't know. And I'd like the half that didn't understand it or sort of understood it to please see someone in the red. And I would like you to go in person, unless you're like a million miles away. You could submit something to them in writing and ask them to call you, okay, so that you can have a discussion. Leave them your phone number and discuss what a relative clause is and see if you can understand it. It's important to understand the relative clause because it's going to make the next unit on appositives easier. Now, an appositive is where you give additional information about something that you've named in your sentence. It can be about any noun you have in your sentence. Remember, a noun is a person, place, or thing. So you take a phrase that gives more information about a noun, and it doesn't have which and that and who in it, or you can take a sentence that has which, that, and who in it, and you have an appositive. The only difference with relative clauses and appositives is that you have to have commas around the appositive. You just do. Whereas in the relative clause, it's optional depending what you mean. Okay, now let's look at some, I think I closed it out. Let's look at some relative clauses. I got them somewhere in downloads. Here we go. Okay. I'm taking Katie Long's. I hope she doesn't mind, but she had a perfect paper, so here we go. I'm taking her sentences that have appositives in. The reason I chose her is there were a lot of perfect papers, but I chose hers because she put that in italic or boldface where the appositive was. So let's look at this first sentence. In 1998, high school students who were studying the Holocaust in Whitehall, Tennessee, learned about the 6 million Jewish victims of the Nazi Holocaust. Now let's look very carefully. We've got our relative clause, our relative phrase here. I'm trying to highlight it, not doing very well. Here we go. Okay. Now all we have to do to turn this into an appositive, we put the comma after students, and we get rid of the who were. And what we have here is studying the Holocaust in Whitehall, Tennessee. What does that describe? It describes the high school students. And we've just added information about the high school students right after it. Appositives have to come right after what they're describing, and we could write it that way. It makes the writing tighter. You have fewer words. Same thing with this one here. They decided to collect 6 million paper clips to make the number, which is hard to imagine. What we do is we get rid of which is hard to imagine, seem more real. Again, we've just tightened the sentence up. I think a better example, that's a good example, but another example is which were, it seemed appropriate that paper clips, which were invented by a Norwegian Jew named Johan Valler in 1899, were worn by Norwegians during World War I as a symbol of defiance of the Nazi occupiers. Now that was a long phrase, but we can turn that into an appositive by just getting rid of the which were. Okay? Next one. For 3 years, the students who grew discouraged, what we can do is just say discouraged, And anytime you have a one-word appositive like that, you probably want to move it right here. Oops, not right there. Right here. The discouraged students. See how that changed it? So anytime you have it, you want it that way. I don't want to go into this one here. The paper clips that arrived from all 50 states and continents came from celebrities, everyday people, and even Holocaust survivors. We want to get rid of. That. And we want to put this after, the comma after, because we've got this renaming paper clips. The paper clips, what about them? They're arriving from 50 states and 6 continents. Now, maybe I need to tell you about something else. A little trick I used to tell my grammar students is a subject always has a noun and a verb. That's a sentence. If it's a complete sentence, it makes sense unto himself. If it's not a complete sentence, chances are it's a relative clause, a participle phrase that we just discussed. Okay, or it's a appositive that just kind of hangs there and doesn't relate to what it's describing. And I like to tell students who have trouble finding the subject of the sentence and the verb to ask the question, who is doing the action? So let's look at the sentence above. Who is the movie called Paper Clips, which shows the symbolic power of ordinary paper clips, was made about the White Hill Project that memorably helps viewers to comprehend the most incomprehensible numbers of victims of the Nazi genocide against the Jews. Now, there's a lot of nouns in there. There's a movie, there's paper clips, there's power, White House Project, viewers, number of victims, or just number, Nazi genocide, Jews. Well, who's doing the action? Who is the main idea in the paper? And usually that comes first, and in this case, whoops, it's going to be a movie called Paper Clips. That's doing the action. Okay. What is the who doing? What's the action? What was that movie doing? Well, for one thing, it's showing the symbolic power, and that helps viewers, and here's the main part of the sentence. Helps viewers to comprehend. That right there is your action. That's what it's doing. Okay? That's what it's doing. The rest of this that's left, and I'll move that back in, all this stuff, these are what I call modifiers. And these modifiers, you want to ask questions that are going to give you information about the noun and the verb. We've modified, well, first of all, we've modified movie, and we could have said that was called paper clips, but that we just have too many relative clauses in there. So we leave it called paper clips, which shows the symbolic power of ordinary paper clips. What's that? What is that modifying? the movie. We can turn this into a participle, showing the symbolic power of the ordinary paper clips. And look, since that describes paper clips, we've got an appositive. Now, I'd only put about one in a sentence, but you could have was made by the White House Project, and I wouldn't put a comma here. And I would just say, showing, what was that, memorably. Okay, I spelled it wrong. Thank you for fixing it. Okay. But the other thing I would talk about this sentence if you were writing a paper is I'd find two different verbs. Okay. So hopefully that makes more sense to you. Who is doing the action? That's going to be the subject of the sentence. What is the who doing? And you have to really look for it. That's the verb. And everything you have left are modifiers. And those modifiers have different names. The first one we learned was the relative clause. The second one was the participle phrase. And this week we move on to appositives. Now let's see what are we doing in class this week. I'll go over that with you. The first thing you're going to do, let me turn this into a student view. Here we go. The first thing we're going to do when we go to this week's lesson is you're going to first take what you wrote last week about participles and the practice on the board and my comments and your classmates' comments, and you are going to revise it so that you have participles in every combination, and then you put it into the Dropbox. That is due by the 22nd. That's not right. It's due by the 15th. I'll have to change that. Now, Lesson 4 moves on to what I've been talking about, appositives. This is a very good film that you need to watch, and watch more than once. And I know some of you are saying, I don't have time to watch it more than once. Then you're only going to learn part of what you need to learn, okay? There's online quizzes. I want you to take those. They're right down here. See if those help you with some of the exercises. Rewatch this so that you can see what I've done. And then you're going to use, read Lesson 4. I don't think some of you are reading the chapters. I think you're going right to the end, and I think I said this last week. Make sure you read the chapter. And you're going to need to place an appositive in each of the sentences you combine. And I'm asking you to having a whale of a time on page 67. Make sure there's an appositive in each sentence, but if you can add relative clauses and participles where they're appropriate, that's great too. Think of language as a puzzle. Play with it. Move the parts around. See what happens. And I think that you'll have, don't take this, take it seriously, but play with the words. How do they sound? Read it aloud. Read it to somebody. Have them tell you what it sounds like. I think that will help. Okay, then by Sunday you'll reply to your classmates. Okay? If you have any questions, you know where to find me, and I'm looking forward to questions. Let me know how you're doing.